We have Kerry Cox on the podcast today. I've known Kerry probably for 15 years, I think, going back to Gainesville, Florida, and Florida Bible Camp. Donnie Dillon hanging out with people down there, and some really good memories of that. And I've always appreciated Kerry and his heart, his ministry, and we've reconnected in the last year or so with some discipleship training that we've been a part of, and it's been a pleasure to get to reconnect with him and get to meet his dad, Robert, and I'm just encouraged by his ministry. He's the campus minister at the Crossings Church in Wentzville, Missouri, which is really close to where I grew up in Union. And so we have some commonality that I appreciate. But one of the reasons I wanted Kerry to be on the podcast is because I appreciate his heart and I appreciate what his church is doing to start new things, campus ministries and planting new churches. And I think it's so important for our churches to hear those conversations, for our church leaders to get in tune with being mission-minded, starting new churches, having vision, dreaming. And so I just want to pick your brain a bit, Kerry, and hear some about what your church is doing, some of your church DNA, and just for us to be encouraged and hear some of the challenges that come along with that. So you guys posted a video a week or two ago of singing at the hospital here during this COVID-19 pandemic. Can you tell us kind of how that started and some about your church, how that reflects your church?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're a church that really does want to love and help the community, and at our base level in our DNA, we want to be a church that helps people with their hurts. The world's pretty messed up, so even outside of COVID, that's a pretty heavy focus. And so, being that kind of church, I got a phone call from one of our members who helps kind of coordinate all our ministries. Her name's Melanie, and she was like, "I have an idea," and I was like, "Okay, what is it?" And she was like, what if I got contacted, the hospital, and I talked to them and said, hey, we want to do this thing. We want to encourage your staff. We want to encourage the patients that are there. We want your workers to know that the Crossing Church loves them, that we appreciate what they're doing. And so what if we did a singing there? And I was like, okay, cool. I was like, what do we need to do? She was like, well, I already contacted the SM, the network, and I'm talking to the president. I was like, okay, excellent. So she calls me back a little while later and she says, it's on. She's like, he thinks it's a great idea. He loves it. She's like, I'll take care of this end if you can take care of the church end. And I was like, all right, let's do it. So we put a message out to the church and said, hey, tomorrow night at the hospital here, the local hospital, we're going to meet on top of the parking garage. We're going to park one spot, away from each other. Everybody has to stay 6 feet away from anybody who's not in their household, but we're going to sing. And the whole goal is to encourage the hospital workers, the frontline workers who are taking care of people and serving people, and let them know that we appreciate them. And so we all met there, and there was probably, I would say there's probably close to 600 of us out there on the top of that parking garage. And it was neat because you looked out, and as you looked at the hospital, you could see the workers standing in the windows and waving at us and stuff. And we started singing, and it was just a really cool experience. And at first, you always know you're gonna have haters no matter what you do, right? And so here we are doing this during quarantine time, and I'm like, man, we're gonna have a lot of people say we shouldn't do this probably, but we're sticking to the guidelines, and so we're gonna do it anyway. And to my surprise, there were a couple people who made little comments, but even the ones who did were like, hey, maybe not the best idea, but your heart's in the right place. But the cool thing was how many nurses and doctors from that hospital got onto that video feed and were like, you have no idea what this meant to us after a long day. And it was just cool to see like how something that like we would view as like small and simple, right, be so touching to the people who were working in that hospital. It was an amazing thing. And I do think that probably comes from the heart of our church. We're a pretty unchurched church, and we've got a lot of hurt and brokenness and, shady pasts and all those things in our church. And so I think whenever you come from that background and God's worked on your life and he's used the church to touch you and change you, when you throw out an idea like this, and you're like, hey, let's have 600 people meet on the top of a parking garage tomorrow night, at a last minute's notice, people are like, yeah, let's do it. Like, because they've experienced that love from God and from God's people and that encouragement. And I think they want to make sure that other people feel that as well, because they know the difference it's made in their lives. So it was just a really cool thing. And then one of the KSDK here in St. Louis did a a story on it one morning on the news, and that was really cool to see as well. And they were talking about how uplifting it was and encouraging it was. So it was a really neat event, and really it was put together by one of our members. Ultimately it was her thing, her idea, and she let me be a part of it, and the rest of us be a part of it, and God did some really cool stuff with it.
So how many people showed up for that?
There was between 500 and 600 of us, I would
Yeah.
bet. We filled that top lot, and then there's also a ramp that goes down the lot, and we filled the top lot, and then we actually had to park cars in spaces next to each other and still had to keep people 6 feet apart, which was an interesting thing to try. But yeah, I would say there were well over 100, 125 cars at least. Then each car came with their whole household pretty much. And that includes our families. But so we have a lot of our college students who are living together right now in apartments during all this. And so, we had groups of college students pull up in cars full of people they were living with. And then we had families, and we even had some friends of families that ended up showing up, and some members from our church plants drove from the church plants over to join us as well. So it was really neat. Really neat.
Do you have an idea of how many people watched that? Because it was a lot.
The views, the initial video, I just put up a live Facebook video of it, just kind of trying to show my friends, and I think that one has close to 50,000 views now on it, and then the church also put one up, and then the other members. There were so many people who viewed that, it was just crazy.
And what I love about that is that it started with a member, and again that reflects that it's not just all top down, and that the people get what they're there for and why they're there. And you mentioned a lot of unchurched. So what percentage of your church are first generation Christians?
I would say it's a really, really high percentage. Most of, like I said, most of our members, they came from backgrounds that weren't very churched at all. If we have 550 or 600 people there on a Sunday morning, out of those, when it comes to at least restoration movement background roots, I would say that there are maybe 20 of us that have a restoration movement background at all. And then we have some members who were nominal churchgoers in the past and things like that, obviously, and or who as kids went to church. But I would say that the majority of our church would say that they would consider themselves unchurched, or didn't have really a connection to God or to a church at all beforehand.
Yeah, and that's obviously so unusual. So I think we have in mind an idea of the whole idea of the unchurched numbers going up, the de-church or unchurched, or the nuns, that group's rising. How do we reach them? And is it our teaching? Is it our worship style? We go to all these different things. It's basically just the conversations we're used to having. We kind of go to our conversation, I think, in that I'm interested in theology, or we've had worship wars. What is it that's going to get unchurched people in our building? Is it relationships? Is it equipping your members for ministry, priesthood of all believers? What gets you to that point?
I really think that, I think it's a combination of things. I think obviously the first thing, it really has to do with our hearts, ultimately. I think that a lot of times whenever we think about church growth and reaching unchurched people and why we're not, we do look to all these other reasons, right? Well, maybe our worship isn't right. Well, we should change our preaching style. Now, I'm not discounting that those things can help. Our worship rocks at the Crossings, and it's a blast, and it's a cappella, which surprises a lot of people, but it rocks. And so for me, I look at it, I'm like, yeah, those things can be beneficial. They can help. But I think where it really starts is a heart. I think we have a gratitude problem a lot of times amongst our brotherhood. I think we've forgotten where we came from. And when you forget where you come from, it makes it very difficult for you to look at the world and have compassion and a heart, have that empathy for them, to where you look at what's going on in the world and you don't feel for them. And so you're not motivated. The love of Christ isn't compelling us to go out into the world and make sure they have something different. And so for me, I look at it, and I think the reason that our church has grown and reached unchurched people, and the reason it's such a young church, has a lot more to do with our heart for people and the position that they're in. When Jesus looked at the world, he said he saw them as helpless and harassed. And I think a lot of times in the church, we've looked at people and we've felt more annoyed by them than we have hurt for them. And so I think that that's part of the problem. But when you look at the world and see it for what it is, if you're really grateful for what God's done in your life, I don't know how we can keep ourselves from going out and loving them, showing them there's something different and something better out there. And I think once you get your heart right, those other things will fall in place. People will come to your church even if they think it's boring, even if they don't like your worship style, if they don't like your preacher. If they know that you love them and that you care for them and that you believe that God has something better in store for them, they'll come to your church either way. I really do think that people long for intimate relationships. The world is full of shallow surface relationships, and a lot of people have never experienced what it really means to have someone deeply care for them, not just here on earth, but for their eternity. And when they experience those relationships, it draws them towards God's people, which ultimately, obviously, your hope is it's drawing them towards God. And so I think that's a big part of it. And then I do think there are things like sometimes, when you look at Jesus's preaching, Jesus was always giving people something they could do. They could grab a hold of the word and see what he was saying. They could do something with it. And a lot of times when it comes to our preaching in our churches, I think we have engaged in a lot of more doctrinal arguments and things like that than we have making sure when people come in that they see that they can take the word of God and that it works in their life, that they can apply it every day. And so when you come to the crossings, I think generally speaking, you're going to hear a lesson to where whether you're a member or you're a first-time guest who's never been to church before, you're like, I see how God's word can work in my life. And for a lot of people, they've never experienced that before. And there's just something powerful about getting the word to people, not trying to get across our argument or our doctrine but just giving them the word of God and saying, here you go. This is how this works in your life. And they're like, whoa, I thought this was just this outdated book that, I couldn't do anything with. And I think the word of God is a powerful thing when you put it in people's hands and lives, and it really does. It does help them. And like I said, I think even with worship, I think the reason the worship rocks at the crossings isn't because our worship team's great, because we're not. Like, most of us don't read music. We're not this polished team. But I think that there's something that shows when you are grateful for what God's done, even when you worship. And I think people come into our services and they look around, and when they watch people worship, they can see that it's not fake. They can see that these people have been deeply touched by God, and that's why they're singing, and that's why they're exuberant in their singing. That's why they're excited. That's why they lift their hands. That's why they cry. That's why they laugh. That's why they do these things during worship, because God's done some really powerful things in their lives. And coming into the crossings, I think another reason that a lot of those people who are unchurched and who are younger, the reason they stay is they have an example of life change. I think about, like, when you look at the Bible, you look at the Samaritan woman, right? And she, once Jesus talks to her and tells her everything she's done and all of her sin, but he also gives her hope. And he says, he says, listen, you're going to worship in spirit and truth. And she's like, wait, everything I've done. I'm a Samaritan woman, but you're telling me I'm going to worship in spirit and truth? And Jesus is like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. And then she brings a whole town to him, right? Well, that's because those people saw something drastically different in her than they had seen before. Or even, you look at Legion, all these different scenarios where Jesus heals someone or works in their lives, and there's this drastic change. They bring crowds to Jesus after that. And I think when people step into the Crossings Church, they see drastically changed lives. They see people who aren't afraid to be honest about where they were, but also to where God has brought them. And those stories are inspiring. They're life-changing. And we have members who, I don't care who you are, no matter who you are in this world, you could look at some of our members and be like, if God can do that with that person, he can do it with married women at our church. And I think people see that, and they're given hope because of it, and they want to come back and they want to find out how they can experience the same thing. Sorry to ramble there.
Yeah, no, keep rambling. That's good rambling. So there, you think about like church culture and ethos. So like, you think about taking a culture like like this COVID-19, they're going to take a culture from your nose or a culture from your mouth. It's like they're getting a sample of like the environment that's inside your body. And when we think about church, we're often thinking about, especially in restorationist terms, which I think is a great paradigm. I would love for us to restore the ethos of the early church.
Yeah.
It's like
Yep,
we're just trying to get dots and tittles and stuff, but it's like, but what was Jesus like?
Yeah.
Like what were they like? And I've quoted him before too many times, but did you know Eric Brown, who was at Campus Church back in Gainesville, probably about the time you were coming by? But
I think I've met him. I don't know him well though.
yeah, he would say like the early church was not trying to be the early church. The early church was trying to be Jesus. Yeah. And that gets at that culture ethos issue. And that's hard to construct. Like you can't just teach culture and ethos. Like you have to embody it and embrace it. So like we would think like a culture of freedom would mean, okay, you could use an instrument, now you're free, or you could lift your hands, now you're free, or it's all these like to-dos, but there's just something like richer in the soil. Like when we think about like the soil of your church and what grows out of the soil that is your church. Like even the parable of the sower, we think about individuals. What about the soil of your church? Like what kind of culture does your church have and how did it get there? And so I think like with what you're talking about is really hard for established churches because their soil's been sitting there for 65 years and it's really hard to get more nutrients or whatever. It's hard to mix that soil up. It's very compacted, right? But when you're starting from something newer, like you've been there since '04 and you have several other plants, like just setting that culture and setting that DNA is certainly hard for an established church to turn those corners and who are we upsetting and what's the norm and all those kinds of things. And so, but I do want us to hear these things and understand that that's reality. Like where you worship, that's reality. And we're not stuck. Like none of us truly are stuck.
Yeah.
But I would love for us, like what I'm hearing you explain is like the Jesus culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fairly large compliment. Like, the ability to be safe to express vulnerable things, anxious things, in an environment with other people like that shows that people have a Jesus heart to be able to receive that and correct if needed to be corrected, I'm sure, but also just love and embrace. And, so I love hearing that. And again, we can be just so doctrinally sound, but miss so much.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah. It's funny because, for years, I think people thought from the outside looking in, for a long time, we were kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of black sheep in a way, it's even in this area. And I think that, people looked at our church, and it's funny to me because I think they thought we were like this liberal group of people. But the funny thing is that doctrinally speaking, we're probably more conservative than a lot of other churches in our area, and probably are closer to restorationist roots than what some of them might be, which is kind of funny to me, at least in the things that I would say, the things that matter, the things that are, essential doctrines that you would look at and they're not disputable. I would say we toe that line pretty hard, which surprises people. It's funny even now, people will kind of hear that we're planting churches and that our church is growing and we're reaching young people and that we're reaching unchurched people, and they're like, oh, so now you guys are an instrumental Church of Christ, right? And we're like, no. And they're like, what?
You got to be doing something that's not right.
Yeah, right. So it's funny the way that's viewed sometimes, because doctrinally speaking, we're very, very conservative, I would say, in a lot of ways. And I really do think you're right. It is a hard thing. You kind of talked about how a lot of churches are older and set in their ways. And I think part of the reason that the Crossings is the way it is, honestly, is because of my dad, who's an older guy. My dad is in his 60s and he's a lifer. He grew up in a Church of Christ. He was going to go to that little church in Belle Rive, Illinois, whether he wanted to or not. His parents were going to make him go. And, but I remember, since I was a kid, hearing my dad talk about, hurting people and things like that. And a lot of people, who may not know my dad was sexually abused, by his great grandfather for an extended period of time and went through a lot of really rough stuff. And I think that even though he grew up in the church, he had a lot of hurts and things like that. And because of that, and because of what God had done in his life later on in his life, I think he looked and realized that other people had that deep need for Jesus as well, and they had hurts, and it kind of brought him in tune to something sometimes as Church of Christers or restorationists that we kind of miss, is that connection with a hurting world. And I remember even after we had been at a church my dad had planted in Illinois, we'd been there 20 something years. And when we went to plant the crossings in 2004, my dad could have very easily stayed there and been comfortable. It was the first time that I think in my life I remember that my dad didn't have to worry about if he was going to have a paycheck. Like he knew he was going to be okay. You know, the church had grown, it was stable. And, but he looked at that, and I think he saw that comfort, and he saw that if he wasn't willing to step out and come on this church plant, I don't think he liked the message that was going to send. So he was like, you know what, although this is scary, I'm getting older and I finally found some stability, I think I need to go in this church plant to show people that love for God and love for the lost means more than our stability, means more than our comfort level. And I think a lot of churches really could learn that from looking at somebody like my dad, who was willing, even at an older age, to say, all right, I'm going to go do this, and it's scary and it may be unstable, and what happens if this fails? I'm in trouble, you know, but I'm willing to break out of my comfort zone and, you know, that security that I have in order to make sure other people have something better, that they can have a relationship with God. And so I think that, you know, in a lot of ways, our church follows that same example. You know, it's a pretty cool thing, you know, to see an older man, I'll call him an old man, you know, have that kind of faith and that kind of love and compassion. I think that's the reason that God says love is the greatest of those things. I think that if you get to the root of the issue, why our churches get set in their ways and that they're unwilling to step beyond their comfort and their security, is because we don't love the way we should. Ultimately, I think that's the issue. You know, when it comes to evangelism, our comfort gets in the way. You know, it's a lot easier to say, well, I'm scared to talk to people, or I don't know what I'm doing, than it is to say, I don't love people enough to do this. You know, you don't hear people say that, right? But we make a lot of excuses for why our churches don't reach the young, why they don't reach the unchurched. But if you boil it all down, if we love God and we love people, we're going to do those things, period. Yep. And it won't be easy, and it won't be smooth all the time, but we'll reach people if we love.
Yeah, it sounds like somebody learning to date, you know, like I'm attracted to her, I want to figure it out. You know, like I just don't think, you know, if the love comes, like you'll do things that you didn't know that you were able to do, right? Like you're going to figure those things out, but because we don't have an attraction to the hurting and the lost, or maybe they even draw out a little bit of our own sensitivity to our own stuff, and we just rather not get into it. And so yeah, I think you're right. Like a lot of the things that we say that keep us from evangelizing are symptomatic rather than the core issue, right? Like the symptom is the sniffle, the core issue is you got a virus. Mm-hmm. And so we keep talking about sniffles, like, well, I don't know enough, or I don't know enough people, or whatever. If only God would send somebody my way. It's like, no, maybe you're just not attracted to people who need Jesus. You'd rather spend time around the people who've already got him, have the conversations you already know. But man, love will drive you to learn new things.
Well, I think that shows up in a lot of ways in our churches. So I think that desperation for our children will push us, because we love them so deeply, to do things we wouldn't have done before. So sometimes, you know, I'll see people who I love desperately who have grown up in the church and other churches, and they're very dead set on what they think and what they feel about certain areas and certain things until their kid walks away from God, or until their kid tells them that they're a homosexual, or until their kid is going through a divorce. And then all of a sudden they're desperate enough to love in a way that would break them through those barriers. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, tell me what I have to do to help my child. Tell me what it's going to take. And they're willing to step out beyond their comfort and their security because they love that kid so much. But the problem is that we haven't loved the world like that. Until it hits close to home, sometimes we we don't have that compassion. I'll use an example for myself, in a sense, I guess. So I still tend to think that the whole coronavirus thing may be a little overblown in my opinion. But at first I was like, man, this is stupid. This is ridiculous. What are we doing? Right until one of my college girls got the coronavirus, who already had health conditions, and Kiana's been on a ventilator for the past week.
Mm.
That changes your perspective a lot, you know. And while for me, I still look at it, I'm like, I think that there's, that there's a lot of hype to this. It changed my viewpoints where I'm like, but there are people like Kiana who are really struggling, who have health issues. And thank God we've been praying like crazy. And she actually got off the ventilator this morning. And
Wow.
is
That's unusual,
which is,
from what I understand.
yeah, yeah, which is incredible. So, but I think sometimes until your heart's connected to something, you're not you're not going to act upon it the same way. And I look at our churches sometimes, and like I said, you get these phone calls from people from other states, and they're like, "What is it I've got to do?" And you tell them, "Man, do this, and this. Maybe you should contact Guy Hammond." And saying that doesn't seem like a big deal until you think about the fact that Guy Hammond was a part of the ICOC churches. For a lot of people, before they found out their child was struggling with homosexuality, they would have never contacted somebody from an ICOC church. But all of a sudden, whenever it hits home and you say that, and you're like, this guy loves God, he loves people, he's been there, he's done it, he's helping people overcome this. It's like, give me his phone number, because you're willing to go beyond what you were before because you love your child so much. And I think we have to look at the world that same way, to where we look and we're like, man, I love those people so much. I don't even know them, but I love them so much. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get past and get through these things that don't really matter, to get to the heart of what matters and what God put us here to do.
That's so well said. So, like, if we were to listen to, like, the things we talk about most reveals what we love the most, like where our heart is at, we talk about the most. So we talk about our kids, or we talk about our pets, or we talk about our hobbies, or we talk about whatever. It's like, if you listen to a year's worth of sermons from a given church, say my church or your church or wherever, like, what would we hear? And what wouldn't we hear?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, just the whole idea of kind of beating certain drums that have been beat on for 75 years, yeah, man, doctrine, is that important? Yeah, man, that's really important. Truth's important. Getting it right's important. It's not the only thing. And even doctrine points you back to the lost, right? Like, you actually can't have good doctrine without being evangelistic.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you can't have good doctrine without loving Jesus and trying to do what he said. Like, that's all doctrine too, So I'm not trying to beat up anybody. I'm just saying, like, maybe it's some introspection on even my own self, because I'm a little bit academic. And so it's like, what am I really trying to get people to understand? And that's going to come out from where my heart's at. If my heart's not with lost people, I'm not going to be talking about them. I'm not going to be driving toward them, right? And so that's certainly an area that I need to work on in my own heart and need to be challenged on. So I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. Well,
Well, and I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt.
It's okay.
Go ahead. I was gonna say, you talked about, you're a little bit academic, and it's funny because so I'm like a spaz, like if it's something, if we're gonna go out and do something to reach people, meet people, like, I'm there. Like, I'm a people person. I'm all over it, and I would much rather do that sometimes than the academic side. But also realizing the older you get, the more you realize there's benefit to the academic side of those things that you've got to learn, and you got to deepen yourself and grow your more mature. And that only happens sometimes through getting in the word and digging and being and learning and studying, right? And I see the importance of that much more now than I probably did when I was younger. And I think there's that balance that we've got to find, right, of the academic side of that, of the, I need to be in my word, but I also can't be in my word so much that I'm neglecting people, and it's funny, Wes Waddell is here with us, and he's on one of our church plants. And Wes is an academic guy, and I think Wes would tell you the same thing. That's probably one of the major things as we've trained and worked with Wes here. Is we're like, dude, Wes, you got to get your head out of the book and get your heart into the people. And when you do that and you learn to connect relationally, you'll be able to use that knowledge. But
Yep.
right now, if you don't have a heart for people, right, your knowledge goes to waste, really. And I think that's where we've got it backwards sometimes, is that we have good answers, we have good doctrine amongst our brotherhoods, right? I look at it and I'm like, man, it's solid. It really is. Biblically speaking, it's solid. But our heads have been in the book so much that our hearts have missed the people that Jesus put us before, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, who's listening?
Yeah.
Like you can know all that, and even if they hear you, are they hearing you because you know them, because they know that you care, and that's just a whole nother dimension. And so, like when I think about the way we've set up the system, is like if we're going to hire you, you need 3 to 5 years of experience, you need to be married, you need a graduate level Bible degree, and you go down the list. And I'm all about education. My wife and I have been through a lot of schooling, like that's very important. And I do think that's part of 1 Corinthians 12 is like one body, many parts. Parts are not all the same. We complement each other. We work with each other. But we do have to find some balance. Like we all have leanings, but we have to find a little bit of balance. And so like when you think about, okay, yeah, go get an MDiv, take 96 hours or whatever of classes and sit in the library for, thousands of hours, that only appeals to certain people. And so, we end up, I think, with a fairly academic pulpit person, because the criteria to get in that position is a fairly academic thing. And people who are listening either want encouragement, that the Bible's encouraging me or helping me in my life, or they want to hear familiar things, that they've heard.
And I think it's like you said, we got to find that balance. It has been neat even here with Wes. I think Wes has learned a lot about become more effective, and I think like he's got to learn to be more balanced as an individual, right? Just like I have to learn to be more balanced as an individual, but also we help bring balance to each other. Like we need those different types of people, obviously, in the kingdom of God. That's one of the great benefits of being a part of the family of God, is that we have such a diverse group of people and backgrounds and the way people think. The academics, you have the ones who are all heart, you have the ones, and you're like, okay, let's work together and make this better. And the churches are better when we do that. The kingdom's better when we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us all back to the posture of like a learner. So even someone who's academic needs to learn relationality.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So how many churches have you all planted, and can you tell us a little bit about what has driven that?
Yeah, sure. So we moved over to Missouri and planted the Crossings out in Wentzville in 2004. And from the very beginning, we talked very clearly from the onset of that plant, this is not the only plant we're doing. Like, this is going to be a church that plants churches, that's just something that's been talked about. And I remember even as a kid hearing my dad talk, we were part of a church in Illinois that my dad and his friends had started in a basement with 20 people. And we watched it grow to, 550, 600 people. I always knew there was going to be a church plant coming. Now, that took a lot longer than we expected it to. But when it finally did happen, one of the things that we talked a lot about is that's not happening this time. We're going to plant churches more quickly. And so we planted the Crossings with about 30 of us in 2004 in Wentzville. And we grew, and in 2014, we decided to plant a church in U City, which is kind of along 170 and 70 in St. Louis. It's down by the city. And so that church plant went out in 2014. And then in 2017, we planted back across the river, back into Illinois again, in Collinsville, Illinois. In both of those plants, one of the things with all of our plants is that we're right now only planting in towns that have universities, colleges and universities. There's a few reasons for that, I guess. One being that that's something, it's a niche for us. It's something we know college ministry, but also when you reach college students, they're very upwardly mobile. They're very able to go out on church plants. The two church plants, 92% of the people who went on church plants through the Crossings Church were one either in our high school ministry or college ministry. So they're very sorry for my fantasies that I'm going off on here. But they were one in college or one of the student ministries. So it's a high focus for us. So the Interbelt plant works with the University of Missouri St. Louis and a couple smaller schools in that area. And Collinsville works with SIUE, Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, and another community college in that area. And then we're getting ready to plant a church in December in Columbia. We launched the campus ministry this past fall to kind of get a pre-launch for that church plant. And obviously, Corona derailed us a little bit on that, but we've already seen a student. We had one student up there starting the campus ministry, and then our students were driving up twice a week to kind of help launch it. And we had a student baptized into Christ last semester, which was awesome. And so our goal, though, is to kind of take those churches here in the St. Louis area and Columbia and then begin to plant churches more quickly than that, to where we can pull people from all of those plants, and they can come here, they'll live here as a team, and they'll train as a team, and then they'll be sent out. And there's lots of other cities on our radars right now, but our goal is just to plant churches that are going to make a difference in people's lives. We don't want to go be a stagnant church that isn't making a difference in the communities and the people of those communities. We believe that God has great plans for all those people in those communities, and that He has given us a specific purpose to go out and make sure they know Him. And so that's what we've been doing over the past several years.
Yeah, well, we appreciate your heart in that. And going back to your dad, who's such a good man, he has so much integrity, and I love you just telling that story about him becoming vulnerable for the vulnerable. I think is really moving, and that's what keeps a lot of people in churches away from church planting, is just the fear of scarcity and lack of resource, losing people. We don't think of sending people; we think we're losing people. But Dallas Willard talked about vision, intention, and means. And so, if you have vision and intention, then the means will follow. And a lot of our churches, if the vision is keep things as they are, or the vision is uphold the faith or whatever, and more inside the walls, and there is a biblical mandate to take care of the house of faith first and foremost in Galatians, but we obsess almost on that, I think. Yeah. And so we really need to realize, like, some of the most successful ministries I know are ones that had no resources but had a vision and an intention and just went after it and started just praying and tapping people and asking people, and they said, yeah, I have that vision too. It's funny you brought that up. Or I have a passion for that same community or that same neighborhood or that same purpose, and all these like-minded people come together. What we don't realize is that God has just surrounded us in resources. If we'll cast the vision, He will be faithful to provide what we need to execute the vision. Yeah. But if the visions just stay here, we'll die. I mean, we'll just shrivel up and die, and so.
It's funny to me. Well, it's funny to me, a lot of times, you hear the reasons why people don't plant churches, and you hear a lot of stuff about resources, but I think if they would kind of maybe take a look at what's happening here, and what has happened, they might change their thinking on that. I mean, imagine being a church of, well, I guess at the time our first plant went out maybe around 350 people. Imagine being a church plant that started in 2004. In 2014, 10 years later, you're running about 350. And you're like, we're going to plant a church, and we're going to have a preacher and a campus minister on staff, and we're going to fund this as a church. We're going to send 30 people on a church plant and fund 2 people. That's a scary proposition in and of itself. But then when you realize that out of that 350 people, probably 175 or more of those are between the ages of 13 and 22. Right there, that becomes a lot more scary prospect, because those people make no money. Our college students, sure, they tithe, but when you make $100 a month and you're tithing them $10 a month, or even 20 if they're, being overly generous, that's not much money coming in. And I think for us, we've always looked at it and we've thought, man, like, God will come through in one way or another. And even now, planting this church in Columbia, during the coronavirus, we were like, maybe we should put off the special contribution to make this happen. But then again, it puts them behind if we do that. And so we're like pushing forward with that anyway. And I think sometimes if churches were able to see you can do a lot more on a lot less than you believe you can. We sent the church plants out with around $150,000 each plant, and that's to get them by for pretty much 2 years with 2 staff members. And that includes them trying to find a place to meet, pay those staff members, make sure their families are being taken care of. And we send them with a church plant of 30 people. So there's a kind of an automatic built-in, tithe there as well. But that's scary. That's scary for the church. It's scary for those guys who go out on the plant and realize, man, I got a couple years to really make this thing work. But it happens. But we have these churches who say they don't do these things for a lot of different reasons, sometimes resources. But I'd be willing to bet you that the majority of those churches have a lot more money sitting in their bank account than what the Crossings would. And I don't say that to slam anybody in any way whatsoever. I say that to say, man, let's do something with those resources, right? Let's not sit on those things. Like, why as churches do we need hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars sitting in bank accounts when we're not starting new churches? Like, for me, I look at that and I'm like, man, if the Crossings had more resources, would it make everything better? Absolutely not. But it would make it a lot easier to plant churches, and we've had to space those church plants out a little bit because you can't do that every year. You can't, as a church our size, and especially as a church that's as young as we are, like I said, on Sunday morning, if there's 550 people there, you've got close to 100 teenagers, a lot of whom's parents do not even come to church. So there's just not a lot to draw from there in a sense. And then you've got another 125 college students there, a bunch of junior hires, even whose parents don't come to church. And then the rest of the church is very young families who are just not getting on their feet. So, it makes it difficult to be able to pull together the resources necessary to make those plans happen. But God's worked on, and he's done it every time we've tried it.
That's awesome.
And now I do think it's neat because I think God is maybe opening some doors, I hope, to where some other churches are starting to look and they're like, hey, we may not be able to do what you're doing right now, but we want to learn from it. And until we learn from it and can do it, can we support, hopefully more churches will jump on that because, man, to think about how many churches could be planted, if we had the hearts that we have going on here, but also the resources to follow those things it's an exciting proposition to think about,
So one of our measures of success is like, how big is your church? And so the goal is always to get a bigger number. But, a lot of churches, just with the culture that they have, are only ever going to probably be a really good 250 member church. And so just what it takes and the culture change, the leadership style changes, the infrastructure to go to 500, 400, 500, 600, only like 2% of our churches are over 500. We would think it was a lot more than that. I think a lot of us would think it was a lot more than that because it just seems like those are the visible ones. And so I think it would be good for some churches to come to grips with, you've kind of hit your lid at 300. Don't get obsessed with becoming 600. Get obsessed with sending 30 or 40, becoming a church of 250. If you send 50, from 300 down to 250, you're losing 50, you're sending 50, right? Mm-hmm. You're staying in your wheelhouse. That's the kind of church you know how to be well with your organization, your leadership style and skills. You're sending people out. So we might say, well, if you had $80,000 to spend, what would you do with it? They say, well, we'd hire a worship minister because we think if our worship was better, more lost people would come. And it's like, yeah, the neighbor next to your church building has been twiddling their thumbs the last 6 years saying, if only that church next door had a good worship leader, I'd probably go there.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, the funny thing is, Matt, I think that if, let's say more churches did that, churches of 300 sent out a team of 30 to go plant a church, I don't think they would stay at a church of 300.
And truly. Because the mindset's changed. Exactly.
Your mind, it does. It changes the way you think. And for us, like, sorry, Corona cough here.
That's probably Corona. I'm glad this is through Zoom.
Yeah, I know, but for us, like even as a campus ministry, there after those church plants went out in the last few years, that was pretty difficult because we sent a good chunk of our most evangelistic leadership type people on those church plants. So the campus ministry takes a hit where basically a whole small group from our ministry goes on church plants every time they go out. And again, when those are they're your more mature people in a lot of ways. They're evangelistic people. They're very passionate people. They're leadership team members. And then even the adults who go out, a lot of those came from the campus ministry. So that's part of your heart, that goes. But the campus ministry, it took us a while to recoup, kind of in a sense, from that and to rebuild because now I've got all these younger people. They have to be raised up, they have to be taught and trained. But now the campus ministry right now is bigger than it's ever been at the Crossings, in spite of having sent those other plants out. And I think God really does bless our sacrifice and our faith when we do something that's scary or that is out of our comfort zone. I think he gives us a blessing on those things. He makes those things grow whenever we're stepping out in faith. And I think we hold everything so tight, we're like, no, I can't, that God's like, I can't give you anymore because you're holding on to it. You need to invest those things, invest your people, and then we'll see what I can do. And so I think those churches, like you said, it would change the way they think. It would change the way they do things if they were sending out those people. And I think it would bring about a blessing, right there.
Yeah, that's so well said. It's like if you think about like if you had a basket full of stuff, like your basket doesn't grow by putting more stuff in it. Your basket grows by giving stuff away. Like you can only put
Yep.
so much in the basket, but the more you give out of the basket, like the bigger basket God gives you, right? And just see that happen so much. So like what? And we could spend 20 minutes on this, but like what are our metrics and are we happy with people attending? It's like, people grow when they're involved. People grow when they're engaged. It's like, we don't just need to be tracking people of like, what's the number to go up, to go down. It's like, the ministries that we've been a part of that have grown the most shifted when we handed all the ownership and responsibility back to the people and said, this is yours. It's time for you to run with it. You know what to do. We've, of course, training and equipping and things have worked into that,
Mm-hmm.
but that's when things grow. And I think we've just kind of bought into a priesthood model a bit. Just
Yeah,
too
definitely.
priestly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, like for us, there's just a massive focus on discipleship, to where people are being developed. And without that development, those church plants don't happen. That I think there is a great ownership whenever the preacher isn't doing everything, right? Like my dad, or we don't study with hardly anybody who's baptized at the church. That happens through our members are studying the Bible with people and baptizing people and teaching them, and then they're baptizing people. And I think the reason that those church plants happen is because it isn't centralized. Like there's no way that any of that stuff would be possible if I was responsible for making it all happen on my own. We wouldn't be planting churches. If my dad was responsible for that, or if just our leadership team. Like I think that everybody in the church feels a sense of ownership because they realize it is someone has discipled them and worked with them and taught them what it means to follow Christ. And now they realize that it's their duty to go out and replicate that same thing for someone else. And that's why those things happen, is because it has been decentralized.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Well, I hope and pray that people have heard from your heart, and I'd love to get your dad on here sometime. He's a really great guy, and I'd love to hear his thoughts on some of these things too. Any last thoughts or words of encouragement for us?
I just think maybe as far as words of encouragement go, I really do think that planting churches, man, it's the way to make things happen in a lot of ways. It stretches you, and we've made so many mistakes along the way. We've definitely learned, as much from our mistakes and where we've messed up than we have what we've done well. Sometimes it's easy to look and, you hear the good stuff, but you don't necessarily, if you're not here, you don't see the day in and the day out and the struggles and the hardships that you face doing this. And it's easy to get this like fantasy view of how it works and how it happens. That's definitely not the case either. But, I really believe that anybody who loves God and loves people can do what we're doing. I really do. I think that if you really care for people, and you really care about what the mission God has given you to do, you can do those things. And Matt, one of the things that we've always said is, man, anytime anything we can do to help anybody else try to figure out how to do this, we are down. Like, if people want to come, we've had people come stay here and visit here and move here and train here, and we've went other places. Like, we really do believe that God can do this anywhere. And if there's anything that we can ever do to help anybody have that, because it's the best part of life, experiencing God working, like He's doing. And if other people can experience that, man, we want them to. We want other churches to be able to look and be like, man, this is so cool. Look what's happening. And hearing those stories is exciting. So if there's anything ever that we have to offer and do for anybody, we would love to. We've been fortunate to have other churches do that for us, where we've went all over the place, and we've learned this here and that here and this here, and we're like, okay, how does this fit into what we're doing and into what God's mission is? And we've learned from other churches. So if we ever get to have that opportunity to give that to somebody else, we definitely want to.
So how would somebody contact you if they had a question or wanted to pursue that?
They can call me. They can email me. My email's kerrymcox@gmail.com. So it's just kerrymcox@gmail.com. Or, I'm pretty easy to find on social media, things like that too. Sure. 636-497-5225. That's my cell phone number. So whatever, any way we can help anybody.
Absolutely. Man, well, I appreciate you and your ministry and your heart and what you're doing. And I'm encouraged by it. I really am. And I'm appreciative that we've gotten to reconnect. And I hope and pray that this conversation is a blessing to some people, and that it plants some seeds, that it sparks something in someone to say, this has been on my mind for some time, and maybe God's finally telling me it's time to get it done, and that they know where to get the resources. And let's just connect those pieces. That's the beauty of what we can do today. We just have so many opportunities to connect these pieces. So thanks for your availability on that. All right, brother.
No, thank you. I appreciate it, bro.
Absolutely.